There we go. So grateful to everybody who's tuning in today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Amy Ebbison. I'm from Worcester, addresses childhood trauma. And we also work with CYCJ, the Collaborative for Youth and Community Justice at Clark University. If you get a chance to check out our website, that would be great. Jen, if you could put that in the chat, that would be awesome. Again, we're really glad to have everyone here today. We started the trauma training series probably about a year ago with the hope that the more information people had about trauma and how it looks, how it's going to impact their behavior, how it's going to impact the way they're interacting with the world, their kind of sense of hopefulness, that if more people understood that, we could maybe not have so many secondary trauma effects. People could be kinder and more considerate and more understanding. A lot of times when something bad happens, it's just the first thing, and more bad things come from that. So our hope is that our community's understanding of trauma goes up, and that's going to bring us all together and help us be more supportive of each other. March of 2020, the infamous COVID beginning month, we already had Reverend Payson scheduled to do our trauma training. He was going to do his training on grief and loss. And we were doing them live, and people were getting lunch, and we were seeing each other in person and hugging and getting information, all that great stuff. But Aaron was the first one who was very ready to go virtual. So his was the kind of first one we recorded. It was amazing. He pivoted quickly from sort of talking about grief and loss in individual lives to talking about pandemic response. I think back in March, we really were all thinking this was going to be a short-lived crisis, that we were going to kind of face it, do what we needed to do, and then things would return back to normal. But right about now, we're like, it's October, it's 7 months since Aaron did that first session. And so he is going to, again, talk a little bit about what's going on right now and where we're at. At times, we've had up to 100 people, actually more than 100 on these calls. So I also feel like we're fried as a community. I think we've been doing so much just feeling like resources are limited, fear is ever present, and everyone's saying we're going to have more, our numbers are going to go up again, we're going to see another spike. Aaron, fortunately, has a lot of experience in responding to tragedy and crisis and responding at the community level. So he is here again today, and I'm so grateful. He always kind of knows the right things to say and is able to really offer us some concrete ideas and suggestions about what we can do to sort of continue coping with this pandemic. So I am going to turn it over to Aaron. He has a couple points in the presentation where he's going to stop for comments, questions, and thoughts. But of course, if they come up, feel free to put them in the chat. Again, we're really glad you're here. We hope that this is going to be helpful and will continue to be watched by people. And I know I have benefited enormously from Aaron's wisdom, understanding, perspective on trauma from a sort of a different place than counseling and helping professionals often come from. So I'm sure it's going to be a rich presentation. All right, over to you, Aaron. Thank you so much. So if you could mute while you're not speaking, camera can be on or off, whatever is most comfortable for you. And we are going to turn it on over. Thanks again, Aaron. So grateful. You hear Aaron? He's got his screen up, but I have not heard him speak yet.
Let's try unmuting. How's that? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. That's
Excellent.
the most said line, right? I think you're on mute. We're glad you're off mute.
Thank
I'll put
you.
myself on mute.
I'm Aaron Payson. I'm minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Worcester, where I have served for the last 21 years. I began my tenure in the workforce as a professional emergency medical technician back in the late 80s. During my first tenure as minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Marietta, Ohio, I helped to found and facilitate a county-wide community crisis response team that served Washington County, Ohio, and its surroundings at times when various communities in the county experienced traumatic events such as significant car accidents, the death of teenagers in drowning in the Ohio River, the flooding that occurred in the area, house fires, and a whole host of other events that the community faced while I was there for 8 years. In 2002, I helped to found our denomination's Unitarian Universalist Trauma Response Ministry team that has responded across the country to a variety of scenarios. I personally have responded to the various hurricanes that have occurred, including Katrina, having operated out of Baton Rouge for a week, and then going back to do a post-event training with congregations in the community in the area, and have gone to forest fires in San Diego. Most recently, I've been working with congregations in Oregon who have been traumatized by the wildfires that have existed, that have been burning, many still out of control in the western part of the United States, and a host of other issues that congregations have faced along the line, including shooting deaths in congregational sanctuaries, suicides, and a variety of other events. So I come to you with a variety of experiences that have impacted communities at large, and my work has primarily been to help bring about the resources and work with communities in order to stabilize them following traumatic events and to help them plan for the future. I'm aware that we are continue to be in the throes of the pandemic, and I hope that what we talk about today can be channeled through that lens and your experience with that lens and the work that you do in the community and your experience of the community at large. By way of sort of going back to what we talked about last March, I want to be mindful of the fact that in terms of the life cycle of disaster, what we are experiencing right now in many ways is what you might refer to as the longest period in disaster recovery, which is called disillusionment. We continue to be impacted by the effects of the disaster. The event itself is not over. So it's one of the dynamics of disaster response called disillusionment. And that is where there is less proximity of our immediate reactions to what transpired back in March when we first started to take up this issue and respond to it. And at that time, we were told all kinds of things about this would be over by spring, and we're dealing now with both the disappointment that we continue to experience this and that it seems to be getting worse in many ways in the country right now as another surge is upon us. And the emotional impact of that and the psychological impact of that is extraordinary. Most of us have coping mechanisms for shorter periods of time, but sustained kind of response to an environment that has been so transformed and so impacted by what we have been experiencing lends itself to longer and potentially chronic kinds of traumatic responses, both on the personal and the community-wide level. So this afternoon, I want to spend some time talking with you about post-traumatic growth on the individual and community level, and what resiliency actually looks like. What are the dynamics of resiliency in order for you to begin to contemplate the ways that you as individuals and the community and you in the community at large are experiencing these dynamics or not experiencing them, and wondering how it is that one can begin to foster such. I want to begin with a poem by Michael Birch, who is an editor and publisher of Holocaust poetry. This was part of a collection of poetic responses to the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue in the iconic Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh. The first time that I addressed a community related to the issue of resiliency was about a month after this incident in a conference at a conference in Pittsburgh, about a mile away from Tree of Life Synagogue. And so we begin with the words of Michael Birch. Where does the butterfly go when lightning rails, when thunder howls, when hailstones scream like winter scowls and nights compound dark frosts with snow? Where does the butterfly go? Where does the rose hide its bloom when night descends oblique and chill, beyond the capacity of moonlight to fill? When the only relief's blanketed fire's glow, where does the butterfly go? And where shall the spirit flee when life is too harsh to face, and hope is lost without a trace? Or when the light of life runs low, where does the butterfly go? Butterfly, rose, spirit, the promise of growth, the presence of beauty, and the very breath of life, face annihilating potential of nature, of violence, of death, and yet the poet addresses this life-death confrontation with a curious hope in the form of a question. Where do these go, hide, or flee? Hidden in this poetic expression of grief is the very answer it seeks. We must answer the question at the heart of the poem. We who have experienced the fury of nature and the harsh face of hate and violence and the serious nature of illness in the form of pandemic. Either we surrender to the logic of such terror, or by dint of human creativity accept the poet's invitation to journey in search of a spirited life and a presence of beauty in the midst of all that would have us concede that our journey is futile. When we talk about resiliency, given this, we're really talking about an intrapersonal process of reconciliation. We know that trauma creates significant distress by challenging people's global meaning, right? Deeply held beliefs and goals, such as what is predictable or controllable. The fact that we have experienced our universe or our communities as places of benevolence. These are all challenged by circumstances that are well beyond our control. And in extreme circumstances, ordinary coping efforts become less effective and relevant because of the sustained nature of the trauma itself. Instead, we want to recover from the trauma. People have to intrapsychically reconcile their pre-existing fundamental worldviews and goal hierarchies with their experience of something extraordinary and horrific. We are a meaning-making species. This is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to resiliency and this intrapsychic kind of experience that I'm talking about. This is a quote from Archibald MacLeish in his play J.B., which is a modern adaptation of the story of the Book of Job. These words occur at the end of the play when Job is sitting on the steps of his house looking over the ashed remains of the environment around him and finding the branch of a forsythia bush. And he is saying to his wife, "Look at the forsythia," and his wife responds to him saying, "You wanted justice, didn't you?" There is no justice, there is only love. And then she quotes these words. She says, blow on the coal of the heart. The candles in churches are out. The stars have gone out in the sky. Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. Individual resilience refers to the processes or the capacity or patterns for positive adaptation during or following the exposure to adverse experiences. It's a result of early and ongoing participation in community. So we know that resiliency is in first and foremost a capacity to be connected and networked with others, to not feel isolated and alone. There is also the sense of the assumption of responsibility for intervention among community members that are served by it. We know from lots of research that one of the most effective ways for communities to respond to experiences of community-wide trauma is to invite the participation of those organizations and individuals that are representative of the community at large, the indigenous resources that exist in every community that's available. And these are often not necessarily resources that have been part of the normal first response structures that communities avail themselves to on a regular basis when they're not in crisis mode. These are often what emerge informally during crises to meet the needs that have not yet been recognized or for which resources have not been made available. And it is truly the common ground work that gets done early on as people start to find each other in the midst of the earliest responses to traumatic events. And you can think about these in terms of people who set up opportunities to feed neighbors and others, to provide clothing and community. I think that in some measure you see this particular dynamic at work at the beginning of what became known as Worcester Together, which is a lot of different community resources that came together out of their experience of wanting to help and helping, and realizing that in order to sustain a response over a longer period of time, they were going to need to be able to be in relationship with all manner of groups doing this work. The availability of interveners to see themselves as resources to the intervention and activity rather than persons being served. So one of the dynamics of community resilience is the ability to think about the language that we use when we talk about people that are involved in responding. Responders and those in need of response are often the same people. And you can think about this in terms of the example like firefighters that are fighting forest fires in the western part of the United States, who are also folks that have lost their homes. And so there isn't a clear delineation between helpers and those being helped in this larger context. And also now to focus on the strengths of individuals in settings, identifying the targets of intervention by recognizing who has the resources and the ability to be able to do the job best, which may be outside of the context of the normal kinds of processes that communities have in place to do this. You want to remember that a disaster, by definition, is an event that overwhelms the normal coping capacity of a municipality or a region. That it is literally defined as that which overwhelms what is already in place and requires then the creative response by a whole lot of community entities, many of which may not have been part and parcel of a community-wide planning effort to respond to disaster in the first place. And then the creation of ongoing and self-renewing social supports to help build and maintain competencies of members of the community involved in the intervention effort, to reach out to those who need to think about things differently. One of the examples that we experienced during COVID was the need to put together a women's only shelter. And part of that came out of the experience recognizing that some of the resources that we had in place really were not trained in the kind of trauma intervention that is most effective with particular populations, especially those who have been involved in sex trafficking and the sex trade industry, and wanting to provide a resource that was trauma sensitive so that we could have maximum impact and provide the maximum amount of effective resources for particular segments of the community.
Aaron, sorry to interrupt you. It looks like your camera is on, but we can't see you. I don't know if that's... a couple of people had asked if they could, and it looks like it's on, but we just see the dark box, and we'd love to see your face.
Interesting. All right. Well, let me try something here. All right, I'm going to come out of share for a moment, or maybe let me try that. How does that work? Does that work better?
Oh, we can see you absolutely now, and you look great in your fall foliage.
I changed my camera, so the other camera apparently is not working while I'm in full screen mode. So let me pause here and ask if anyone has any questions or wants to expound more on what we've just talked about in terms of the dynamics of community resilience. And I'm not able to see the chat, Amy, so if something comes up in the chat, please feel free to share it. Well, let's go on for a few minutes, and then we'll come to an opportunity to talk more with each other about this. So there are a variety of dynamics when we talk about individual resilience as opposed to community resilience. This is a table that Akinvelo and Charney include in their research. And I'm going to make these slides available to Amy to share. And it does include a slide of references for all of the material that we'll as a resource today. You know, the factors that are associated with individual resilience include optimism, cognitive flexibility, active coping skills, physical health, the strength of one's social support network, and whether one has a sense of a personal moral compass. From a cognitive standpoint, you know, this is about maintaining positive expectancies for the future, reappraising, reframing, and assimilating traumatic experiences, accepting stress and failure as ingredients for growth, and minimizing continued appraisal of the threat, maintaining positive self-regard, and having adaptive, positive core beliefs. It also involves seeking help and resources, physical activity and exercise, maintaining that social support network, and altruistic behavior. People who are involved in behavior where they feel like they are present with and assisting those who have needs. Actually, this is one of the strongest adaptive behaviors that we have, and it actually is one of the strongest components of resilience, to see that you have purpose in response to an environment that seems very much out of your own personal control. The existential issues, not feeling isolated or alone, having a larger sense of yourself related to all that is around you, which is referred to here as faith and spirituality, and a purposeful sense for your existence. I want to spend a minute talking about this first thing called optimism. I am more apt to use the word hope than optimism here, and here's why. This is James Stockdale, who was the highest-ranking naval officer held as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and someone who was known very much for his resilience to the situation, responded to the question, who did not make it out of Vietnam? And he reflected this way, saying, that's easy, the optimists. They were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas, and Christmas would come and Christmas would go. And then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go, and then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. In what may be more helpful for us to think about is the idea of hope, which here I'm using the work of Cornel West, who is a Princeton theologian and one of the major public intellectuals of our time. He says hope is not the same as optimism. Optimism adopts the role of the spectator who surveys the evidence in order to infer that things are going to get better. And yet we know that the evidence doesn't look good. Dominant tendencies of our day are unregulated global capitalism, racial balkanization, social breakdown, individual depression. Hope enacts the stance of the participant who actively struggles against the evidence in order to change the deadly tides of wealth inequality, group xenophobia, and personal despair. Only a new way of vision, courage, and hope can keep us sane and preserve the decency and dignity requisite to revitalize our organizational energy for the work to be done. To live is to wrestle with despair, yet never to allow despair to have the last word. I think that is extraordinarily important. To live is to wrestle with despair, yet never to allow despair to have the last word. In other words, while optimism looks at all at the world and says it's all going to get better, hope says, I don't know if it's going to get better, but I know regardless of what happens, there's something important for me to do in response to what's happening. It's the ability to be able to find a place for oneself and to feel like what one is doing is meaningful. Whether or not one changes the entire scenario is not the point of the action. The action is directed toward what one can do and has the ability to do, even if one does not have control over a particular outcome. So I want to pause here for a few minutes of group discussion. And invite us to consider the ways that you have experienced or witnessed personal resiliency during this pandemic, and during the election cycle, and during all of the violence around the George Floyd death, as well as Breonna Taylor and a host of others. I think since George Floyd, there have been 152 plus police-related shootings that have occurred in the country. And then, what barriers have you experienced or witnessed to resiliency on a personal level? And then if you know of resources that are available in the community to enhance this personal resiliency, or maybe you think of resources that are missing for our community, and what have been your most important coping strategies? So the idea here is, how have you experienced personal resiliency or witnessed it? What resources are available to you or in the community? What resources are missing? And what kinds of personal coping strategies have been most important to you? And I'll just open it up and see if anyone has a response.
I really like the piece you said about the difference between hope and optimism, and also the idea that finding a place to help or finding a purpose is really part of the magic that new puppy that undoes this. So that was great to hear. I do think our community has been well engaged in trying to understand how to help each other and help ourselves.
Anyone else?
Fran Langell here. I
Yes.
serve on the Commission of Elder Affairs. I want to say that I'm very proud in our city of what they've been able to do for our senior population. It's me personally to get the phone calls from the senior center and to know that I'm not forgotten, because other than family, I see very few people and I'm a very social person. So this has been really extremely helpful to me personally, but I also want to say that extending the outreach into our community has been a great effort on the part of those folks at the staff of the senior center. So that's one aspect of our city that I'm familiar with, and that I know there's a great many things that go on. And for all the work that all of these people do, I am sincerely grateful as a citizen of this city, which I think works very hard to take care of everyone in the great diverse population in which we live. Thanks.
Thank you, Fran. And I want to just piggyback on that by saying, so one of the first things that the congregation that I served did was to create caring circles that divided up all of the phone numbers and email addresses for all of the active families in the congregation, and went about the business of just simply touching base with everyone. And I think about this on a community-wide level. I think that the Area Agency on Aging in the city did a remarkable job trying to reach out to all of the folks through the senior center and through other mechanisms to check in on people to make certain they had access to food and to medicine and to healthcare resources if they needed them. I can imagine this thing happening on a neighborhood level, where one of the most effective things that an individual can do to feel like they are they're participating, making a difference, is simply to create a call list of the people that they have not heard from or spoken to in the last 5 months, and to simply begin the process of reaching out and having informal conversations. We can't underestimate the efficacy of people feeling like they are not forgotten and not alone in this. And it is one of those things that happens early on in trauma responses and then begins to kind of fade away as people get pulled in other directions. And it might be just the thing during this time when we're experiencing a surge for various entities in the community to re-engage that effort, so that people are able to know, if they haven't had those kinds of contacts, that there are people around them that are thinking about them and that they're remembered. Any other comments about resources or what you've experienced in terms of resiliency? All right, let's go back into share mode and let's talk about community resiliency a little more deeply. So when we talk about the importance of community, we're really talking about the emotional strength that accrues from relationships with people and organizations. The perception that one is actually part of a safety net and able to act on one's interest when confronting or recovering from stressful situations. Being in a relationship, having fewer psychological, social difficulties, and reporting greater perceptions of control and family support have significantly been associated with the experience of resilience. So the notion of deep connections with both organizations and individuals is one of the primary means for us to build a sense of resiliency for individuals as a community effort. This does not begin at the moment that a trauma is experienced. This really begins long before a trauma is experienced, in order to be able to mitigate against the kinds of impacts that a trauma can have long-term on individuals and communities. So, begin the process here by thinking about, for yourselves, who in your life models resilience? Who do you know and who do you honor in your life as someone who reflects the dynamics that we've been talking about. What is the state of your social support network? Do you feel like you have access to individuals and resources through your social support network that are effective in this moment for what you need? And this is particularly challenging if we're experiencing a moment of Zoom fatigue, if you will, or technological fatigue. And those are the very means through which our social support networks are maintained. There is a challenge associated with that. And so it takes some creative thinking about how to meet that challenge. One of the things that's happened in the congregation I serve is that we have small groups of teens that have been meeting outside in socially distanced capacities. And what has transpired along with that was not planned necessarily, but so welcome, was that the parents that were dropping them off started their own group in the front parking lot in a socially distanced fashion. So looking at the informal opportunities to create moments of deeper connection and support in the work that you do, and looking at what is the residual of the work you're doing that can be employed to affect and sustain those deeper connections is powerfully important. Learning how to face your fears instead of avoiding them. I'm mindful here of the lesson of the seagull. Any of you who have been to the beach or who observed seagulls, one of the things that you will never observe a seagull do is stand facing away from the wind. When they do that, it does horrendous things to their feather plume. So one of the things that seagulls do is always face the wind in order for it to be able to flow around them in a way that does not do damage to their bodies. This is a lesson well worth us remembering when we're in a state of extraordinary trial, and that is for us not to ignore it, but to figure out ways of being able to face it and address our needs and the needs of the community head on during the crisis. Identifying, utilizing, and fostering particular character. And what do we mean by that? I think what we mean by that is that we want to develop within ourselves those internal resources that give us the strength to do exactly what we've just talked about, which is to face our fears. And that has to do with mustering the courage to be able to speak our truth and to do so often in environments where that truth may not be reflected by others. And one of the strategies that's really important is to find those people in your life who can be supportive of you in telling your story and declaring your truth in a way that is satisfactory. I want us to think about, as a community, the experience of protest, not as necessarily not as a dangerous event, but as fundamentally a community-wide expression of the character that has found the strength to speak their truth and to face their fears, and to actually see it as an invitation to begin to engage each other differently, as opposed to a danger to be avoided or something to be castigated against, because it brings up all kinds of things for many others that are uncomfortable. It's the ability of communities to face their discomfort that is most important in terms of their capacity to move through and beyond moments like the ones that we face in our country right now. The issue of strengths, what is it that you have and that you believe you are good at, that you can apply under the circumstances and attending to one's physical well-being? The reality is that trauma is as much physiological as it is psychological, emotional, and spiritual, and that trauma lives in our bodies, and it requires a body-wide response in order to impact the effect of trauma. all of the various neurochemical and hormonal responses to trauma that if we're left in chronic discomfort because of those processes, we actually bring about the potential for chronic dis-ease, and requires us to take an extra measure of care for ourselves and for each other in order to mitigate against those long-term processes. The dynamics of community resilience. We talk about 4 different adaptive capacities. This is the work of Dwayne Gill: social capital, community competence, economic development, and information and communication. And if we think about these in terms of the cognitive, behavioral, and existential dynamics associated with them, then we can see more clearly what is required of us as a community in order to build resilience. From a cognitive standpoint, we need to have that sense that we have social support. We need to be able to engage in critical reflection and problem solving, and to be flexible and creative in the process. We need to have trusted sources of information. This has been one of the more extraordinary dynamics of what we face right now, given the current tenor of our country and the advent of concepts like fake news, and the fact that many of us are addicted to 24-hour news cycles and news channels, that we're looking for reliable information, and we're in a period of time where, depending on who you talk to, everyone else is a liar. And so it requires the community to develop resources that members of the community can rely on as being true and truthful and timely in terms of the information that they're sharing. And I think each of us needs to be thinking about where in our community do we go to find the most accurate information that we believe is available to us, and how do we then perpetuate that information? What are the means through which we are able to discern truth, and how is it that we then are able to share what we know with each other? In terms of community-wide trauma support, by the way, that is one of the most effective things that trauma teams do, is that they are able to do trauma briefings and updates that give people an opportunity to hear succinctly what we in fact do know, and what are the most effective ways to respond to what we do know. Behavioral components receive social support, organizational links and cooperation, broad citizenship participation, community action, political partnerships, the level and diversity of economic resources, and having a responsible media with skills and infrastructure. The issue of diverse economic resources, this is something for us to think about as a community, and that is because of the importance of what I have referred to early on as indigenous responses, as well as the reality that we have formal vehicles for the maintenance, protection, and distribution of economic resources, suggests that there is the potential and ongoing potential for conflict between these two, because often the indigenous resources that are most effective in responding to the needs of a community in crisis are not the same resources that have had access to the economic development means available through the formalized mechanisms that communities have developed over time. And it behooves us to think about that dynamic ahead of time, to encourage ongoing conversations so that communities that have previously not had access to economic development are encouraged in relationships to figure out with those particular systems of distribution, protection, development, how it is that they can tap into those resources, especially as one looks toward being a community-wide, part of a community-wide response during times of trial and tribulation. From an existential standpoint, we talk about social embeddedness, and that is how do you perceive the strength of your relationships within the context of larger social structures? Are you simply an observer? Are you someone who's a mover and shaker in those structures? How significant is your sense of community? How connected do you feel, and how attached are you to place? One of the earliest lessons that I had related to the issue of place came about following flooding that regularly occurred along the Ohio River in Marietta, Ohio, where I served. And there were parts of the community that were chronically vulnerable to heightened flood levels along the Ohio and Muskingum rivers. One of them, literally the community across the bridge from downtown Marietta, that was a community that was fairly marginalized historically, and because of the property being so vulnerable. And the elder of the congregation that I served, a woman in her 80s, who was a long time teacher in the community who taught many, many people, told me the story once of students that she was discussing the latest flooding that had taken place. And, she asked a question that she thought was very innocent, and learned very quickly how difficult it was. And she said to one of her students, "Why do you continue to live in an area that floods?" And the student simply looked at her and smiled and said, "Because it's my home." I think that we have different assumptions about why someone might live where they live, or work as they work, or act as they act. And then until we're willing to have the kinds of conversations that allow them to express the value of that place, that work, or that way of being, we may never know and understand what it is that compels people to be where they are, do what they do, and behave how they behave. So the risks and resilience around risk and resilience involves belief systems as well as organizations and communication. So if we talk about resilience as being mitigating against maladaptation to particular events and experiences, then we think about what are the risks for maladaptation versus what can be key to resilience itself. And so let's just take up the issue of belief systems as an example here. The risk to maladaptation are shattered assumptions, ambiguous or senseless loss, a sense of failure, right? Blame, shame, and guilt, hopelessness, despair, a sense of bleak outcome, powerlessness, helplessness, feeling overwhelmed, the multi-generational reality of trauma, right? And the legacy of trauma and losses and catastrophic fears that is transgenerationally transmitted. And then the issue of spiritual distress, a sense of injustice, punishment for sins, cultural and spiritual disconnection, a sense of the great void that we can't seem to fathom or cross. What mitigates against these kinds of potentially chronic maladaptations to trauma are opportunities for meaning making, right? To be in a context where people are able to explore what has happened to them in a way that helps them realize and recognize that they're having a normal response to an abnormal situation. To be able to contextualize their distress and to gain a sense of what they are already capable of doing and have often done in relationship to difficult and traumatic experiences. Gaining a sense of coherence as shared challenge so that it's comprehensible and manageable and meaningful because you feel like you are a part of something larger than yourself and not just simply the subject of trauma as an individual. Having a positive outlook, hope and encouragement, affirming strengths. And then the notion of transcendence and spirituality, now we're in my ballpark, right? Rituals are really, really powerful and can be very, very important related to this work. The notion that we engage in prayerful moments of meditation, ceremonies that help us recognize transition and so forth, purpose, meaningful bonds, pursuits, activism, learning, growth, transformation, appreciation. These are all part and parcel of the process of people gaining a sense of purpose and meaning in the midst of something that can be otherwise experienced as meaningless or worse, just completely destructive and devoid of any benefit whatsoever. It is not that when I'm suggesting that people feel like we have theological systems that say this is happening because it's a matter of God's judgment or punishment, or this is happening because there's a larger purpose that one has for us. You know, I teach a course on the sociology of death and dying in the spring at Worcester State University. And one of the things we talk about are some of the effective and ineffective responses to people who've experienced significant loss and death. One of the most ineffective responses from a theological standpoint, from my standpoint, are the responses that say, God needed another angel. My experience is the quickest way to create a God-hating individual is by blaming God for death. Instead of understanding that death is a normative part of what it means to be a biological being, and that our faith is what sustains us in helping to recognize and cope with that reality, that we are not alone, that we are guided by, influenced by, and able to connect to a source of strength larger than ourselves. As one particular spiritual dynamic, certainly not the only one. There are other organizational patterns related to, and I want you to think about this in terms of the places that you work or the community organizations and governmental organizations that you've experienced. What aids maladaption are rigid autocratic structures that are potentially unstable, chaotic, unreliable, leaderless, if you will. Enmeshed, highly conflictual or estranged and disconnected organizations. Organizations where vital bonds and role functioning is lost. Socially isolated, unacknowledged, or stigmatized loss, institutional economic resources lost or depleted. And on the other side of the coin, what makes for resilience in communities are the flexibility to adapt and restabilize, restoring structure, routines, and predictability, having a sense of community connectedness, lifelines, mutual support, and having appropriate economic and institutional resources to be able to mitigate against the economic reality and uncertainty that anyone faces at any given moment. We might talk about this more in terms of a matrix for healing, right? That community resilience encompasses at least 4 themes. One is to build community, enhance social connectedness as a foundation for recovery. This involves strengthening social support systems, coalition building, and information resource sharing. To participate in collective storytelling and validation of the trauma response with the emerging story broadened enough to encompass many different varying experiences. What happens most during traumatic experiences is that you have micro narratives that occur within the context of individuals or subgroups that vie for allegiance by the group as a whole. Isn't this the way it was experienced? And communities worth their salt understand that trauma is first and foremost experienced differently by different people who have varying experiences, but also varying traumatic responses to what has happened. And the most valuable thing we as a community can do is to mitigate against the tendency to say, this is the way it happened, this is the only way it happened, as opposed to saying, what happened to you, and do you see what happened to you in the larger context of what's happened to all of us? Reestablishing rhythms and routines of life and arriving at a positive vision for the future with renewed hope. Let me stop there for a moment and ask if there are any responses or questions. How do you see what we've been talking about in terms of your own experience or the community at large?
I'm hoping other people will jump in, but absolutely really helpful to plug what's going on now into this framework has really helped me kind of think about what is helpful and what isn't. Do you have any experience of like from different faith perspectives? Is there something that like works better than other things? I'm just thinking about, this is a time that we probably all need to call on faith in some way, shape, or form. And I'm guessing that the extent, sort of however faith looks for us, is going to play into our ability to adapt and cope.
So I often talk about the difference between religion and spirituality, right? Religion is the context in which people bring their spirituality and the context in which spirituality grows. But it is more a formal institutionalized structure than it is spirituality itself. Spirituality is, at its most basic level, the means by which human beings create meaning in their lives and what they ground themselves in terms of that meaning. So what's really important in a context like the one we're talking about is when you have this global experience of sort of meaning shattering experience where things that you relied on in the past or believed in the past have been really, really challenged or destroyed, is to be in a context where that experience of being challenged or feeling rudderless is not castigated. Like you have little faith because you're experiencing that. Instead, to say to people, this is a process of rediscovering for yourself what's most important. I have lots of people who have come to me over the years that have experienced rage and anger at God and other words that are used to describe God, and who are ashamed because they've been told that's blasphemous. And then I open up the Psalms and I say, let's read about rage for a few minutes. People who just tore into the divine in ways that we don't often read publicly. To recognize that it's a very human process to do this kind of wrestling. So from a faith traditions standpoint, I think what people can garner from various faith traditions are the ways in which they can mitigate against the kind of social isolation, blaming activity. I'm thinking here within Judaism that has just finished the season of the High Holy Days and come through Sukkot, and now Simchat Torah, which is the celebration of the end of the Torah cycle and the beginning of reading the cycle again. And one of the things that I commented on this year was what's fascinating to me about this ritual, we talked about the importance of ritual, is that within the Judaic tradition, in the same service, they read the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Genesis. The end of Deuteronomy involves blessing the tribes of Israel and Moses standing on Mount Nebo, looking over the Jericho plain, the plain of Jericho, and recognizing he's not going to make it into the promised land. And so it's a moment of grief, a moment of blessing. And the community is standing with him, looking over this, knowing they're going to go into the promised land. And the cycle of Torah reading ends, and it begins again with the creation story in Genesis. And one of the most powerful dynamics of the creation story in Genesis is the creation story in Genesis is about the creation of all beings, not just the the state of Israel, or the Israelites. It is about dealing with, if you know the backstory to Genesis, it's about also dealing with cultic purity in a land where you're going to encounter others. So the context in which these stories exist is a people who is about to enter an area that is already occupied. And what is it that we need to have in service to this experience that can be very traumatic? And that is, we need to have the awareness that we're not discovering a land that is unoccupied. We're not coming into a land that has been given to us. It's a land that's been given to lots of people. And it's a promised land, not just for us, but people who have been existing there forever. And so what consciousness do we need to go into this? We need the consciousness that says, how are we going to go along and get along in this reality? And one of the things we need to remember is everyone is created by the divine, by the source of creation in the universe, not just us. So from a spiritual standpoint, I think this moment requires us to rethink and to re-examine what it is that we have sort of hung our hat on as people of faith. What we are required to do in this moment is to extend ourselves into the wider community and into the world in order to bring about the kind of love, hope, and justice that we have been told is available to us, to become agents of the divine, if you will, in this process. Not simply to say that God will solve this. One of my favorite jokes is the guy who is a flood is about to occur, and there's a guy who's a very fervent religious man, and a car drives up in front of his house and says, the flood's about to come, get in the car and go away with us. And the man says, no, I'm a person of faith. I'm going to pray about this. God will save me while the flood waters rise. And he goes to the second floor, and a boat comes past the house, and the boat driver says, get in the boat and come away with us. The flood is rising. And he says, no, I'm a person of faith. God will save me. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about me. Go ahead. The flood rises. He gets on his roof, and a helicopter comes by and drops a rope and says, get on the rope and we'll take you away. And he says, no, I'm a person of faith. I want to, I'm going to rely on God. God will save me. And ultimately the flood waters rise and he drowns, and he finds himself standing in front of the Almighty. And he's pissed. And he says to the Almighty, what happened? I was a religious man. I was told that if I prayed and so forth, that you would save me. And the Almighty is heard saying, I sent you a car, a boat, and a helicopter, right? What were you thinking? It's that kind of experience of having to rethink our faith in terms of the lens through which we experience all of those things that we might attribute to a larger entity, a universal entity, and seeing our neighbors and our community as manifestations of that, as vehicles through which we can experience that love and that grace and that hope and that sense of meaning and purpose. That there's no separation between the divine and others in the midst of this. The divine is reflected through and permeates through all of this that we do. Any other comments?
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Arimo, and I'm a consultant with the Office of the Victims of Crime through the WDPH.
Yes.
I'm so happy to be here. So it's amazing to actually listen into that last bit that he shared, because I normally say God has shown us that he has divine ability, but I do believe we have a personal responsibility to tap into that divine ability. So that said, on resilience, so basically I like to look at resilience as a response to conflict, like how you respond to conflict or how you respond to issues that are stressful. So what I've always struggled around, and hopefully, always thought that it's something that any form of leadership can actually maximize on, is on local leadership and local initiatives, like a question about what have I done to achieve resilience? What has my family done? What has the community done? Because at times we get lost as a community, relying on systems, be it the government, be it church, be it any other organizations, so that we can be able to feel like there's solutions, or feel like we can actually achieve some form of resilience. So at times I get to feel like the resilience bit at times gets conditional, like what are we receiving or what are we getting so that we can actually achieve some resilience. So I think the challenge also is in conflict resolution at the very beginning. As a community, are we owning our problems so that we can also own our solutions? Are we actually looking at it from me and you, as opposed to what the government isn't doing, or what the church isn't doing, or what my neighbor isn't doing? So at what point do we actually reflect on our personal responsibility? And that way it can have a ripple effect to a communal responsibility. So that if my neighborhood has 4 houses on the streets, what are we doing so that we can actually feel a bit okay to face tomorrow? So I think that's also something else, like in our own little spaces, we can all challenge ourselves as far as creating that environment to know that it is okay to try and, work around in your own little spaces, so that it can actually reflect, in a wider scope. Because at times I get to feel that we really forget that we can also make we can make a change, we can make a difference, as opposed to looking at the bigger picture. Like I think grassroots, basically, if the grassroots get it, everything else will get it, or the larger reach will get it. So yeah, as far as resilience, I'd like to hear what you think, or your experience on, as a community, owning their problems and actually coming up with their own solutions. Because I know in my experience, I've been involved in a lot of community dialogues and conversations where we would only facilitate that environment for people to vent, speak out their problems in different setups, be it in mental issues, be it in drugs, be it in domestic violence, at times also ethnicity or racism. So you create an environment where they just vent, like they even go at each other. No, I think you guys do this, we need to do that. So you give them that environment, and then you facilitate them to come up with their own solutions. What can we do? Just for a moment, assume there was no government. What would you do? Just for a moment, assume there was no reach. You cannot reach anyone. What would you do? So I think that's also a challenge in our own little spaces. Thank you.
So I want to bless you and thank you for bringing this up and for saying what you've said. For those of you who are particularly interested in this issue of grassroots response and indigenous response, I want to commend to you a book by Rebecca Solnit, Solnit, called A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. Because what Solnit argues is exactly what you just described. And that is, the most effective responses to communities that have been traumatized are grassroots and indigenous responses. And where government fails most often is when they come in and strive to take over responses in an area instead of partnering with and resourcing the indigenous and grassroots efforts that are already underway. What she also chronicles, interestingly enough, is the notion that revolution on a regional or national scale actually finds its genesis in these experiences of grassroots being empowered to meet the needs of people who are experiencing these kinds of things. And she goes back to talk about the Mexican earthquake and the Mexican Revolution that resulted years later from that, and looking at the trajectory of the community leaders involved initially in the response and how they evolved into movements for substantive change. So if there's any kind of silver lining to COVID, it is that we are seeing a number of community-based agencies and grassroots groups that are beginning to find their power. And what someone will probably identify me as a radical here, so let me just claim it, right? I really believe that what is most effective in dealing with communities and trauma is for those formal institutions of control to really step back and to think about the building of relationships with grassroots and indigenous responses and the resourcing of those responses in a way that empowers them to carry out whatever it is that they're carrying out. We've seen this in a variety of contexts happen. I know that Worcester Interfaith has got a number of cultural brokers that they're working with right now to try to bring about resources in underserved communities in the Worcester region and populations that have particular cultural orientations or that reside in cultural enclaves. But it's more than that. It's really about a community that says, we're not just simply going to rely on the formal processes we have. We're going to begin to recreate these processes in a way that actually affects the people who are most vulnerable here over time. And while I absolutely agree with Fran that there have been the city has done some extraordinary efforts to protect and to bring about resources for its citizens, and I applaud them for doing it. I also recognize that there are areas where we as a community could do a whole lot better to listen to the voices of those who are speaking from the grassroots and who are voicing experiences and needs that often don't find their way into the public discourse in the way that they could and have during this time. Other comments? Let's go back to screen sharing for just a few more minutes, and then we'll take up the second set of questions here. So when we talked about this is something that I used in the first thing that I did back in March, and it's worth reviewing again. One of the things that continues alienation and that actually adds to maladaption in communities at large is the creation of meta-narratives that isolate or ignore or disregard the micro-narratives of various members or subpopulations in the community. And so the organization that I work with talks about the issue of maintaining sacred ambiguity, and that means the ability to create a meta-narrative that may have vastly different experiences in the same narrative, right? So I want you to think about this in another kind of context. If I'm working with a community that has experienced gun violence, I might engage them in an activity to do a storyboard experience where people are encouraged to put what they remember about the experience up on newsprint. And someone might say, I heard 6 shots. And the rule in doing this kind of exercise is that you are to put down what happened to you and happened to you only, not what happened to someone else. And you cannot take anyone else's experience off. You can't alter anyone else's experience. So if someone else said, I heard 3 shots, they can't come up and say, cross out 6 and say 3. They have to say, I heard three shots. And the point here is that in the future, when people read the narrative, you want them to be able to find themselves in it in some fashion. And the ability of communities to be able to hold different narrative orientations toward the same experience without claiming the superiority of one narrative over another. And I'm talking here about in a traumatic situation, is really important. And so you think about this in terms of the kinds of violence that communities have experienced and the experience of underserved communities versus communities that have traditionally been able to garner more than their share of resources. Our ability as a community to give voice, to really be open to the voices of everyone involved, most especially those who have been underserved, and to be able to carry the integrity of that experience within the larger context of the story as it moves forward, is very powerful. In the absence of that, what you get are communities where you have populations that are simply the experience of disenfranchisement and the experience of being ignored gets carried forward as the primary experience in the larger community, and it disincentivizes people to be involved in the larger responses that need to occur, or it creates disillusionment so that any other attempt to involve and invite people into relationship has to move past this barrier of a history of being ignored, being forgotten, all of those things. And so part of what creates resilient communities is to think through whose experience is missing from this narrative that we're creating about what we've gone through. And how do we incorporate that into the narrative in a way that honors and supports the fact that people had other experiences. And so for me personally, this is the hard work of history, if you will. When we talk about in our communities at large, when people talk about revisionist history, my experience of that more times than not is the experience of someone who says, no, it's not revising the history, it's expanding it. It's making room for the fact that the entire story has never been told. And we deserve the opportunity to be able to listen to the experience of others, to unearth the narratives that have not been formally part of it, and to learn something about what we can about the scenario based on those narratives that we're now accessing. I think I'm going to, I want to talk for a moment also in terms of resiliency about what the frames that we use to identify people who have been very important in any kind of community response to trauma and tragedy. In particular, I want to talk about the word hero. And I want us to think about how we use the word hero. I'm saying this as one who was named early on in the COVID response as a community hero. And I will say to you that I don't think, I certainly don't, and I don't know of anyone who's been named a community hero that really, that believes themselves to be heroic. Because all of the people that we're talking about are people that were doing what they were bidden to do based on their own values and their own sense of obligation to the community at large. And while that particular service might be experienced by others as heroic, for the person who is responding, it is simply what they had to do. And there are stresses that can be placed on people because of the way in which we label folks who respond. So this first picture of a paramedic carrying a child was the experience of a child that was stuck in an abandoned well for a couple of days and who was rescued by workers. And the paramedic carrying the child is the one who went down into the hole that was dug beside the well and pulled the child out and brought the child out. The second picture is of a firefighter carrying a child that was killed in the Oklahoma City bombing. And the story of these two first responders is important. The paramedic carrying the child who was found and rescued from the well owned the copyright image to this particular image and was constantly being approached by media and other people to retell the story. And the response of that paramedic was eventually to quit the fire service, and he committed suicide. The firefighter paramedic who's carrying the other child from Oklahoma City immediately gave up the rights to the photograph so that he didn't become consistently the focus of attention of the response. And I believe continued and continues to serve in that capacity in Oklahoma City. I want to take this off these images because I think that's traumatic enough. The issue for us in terms of sustaining resiliency in community is to think about how it is that we address the people that we want to honor the most about what we've been through. And to not make assumptions about their capacity to handle what the kind of praise and attention that we want to give them. And to be careful to ask them how they want to be addressed. Because the level of, and I think about this in relationship primarily during this time with our healthcare community, nurses and doctors and paramedics and others who have been on the front line of this. A lot of our frontline workers, our grocery store clerks, people who have put their bodies between us and the virus. I personally experience much of what they've done as heroic. Most of them do not. Most of them see themselves doing the job that they love and that they believe they are called to do. And I think part of what we have to do as a community is to reflect a sensitivity toward how they want to be addressed and honored. And some of them don't want the experience of that ultimately because it adds even more stress to their lives. And so being sensitive to that over time, I think, is powerfully important. The role of resistance in resilience. So we've heard a lot of talk and seen the use of the word resist in a lot of what we're experiencing in our world right now in terms of dominant paradigms and all kinds of things. But resistance under this circumstances, really the kind of initial kind of response that we are able to, the kind of strength we can muster in ourselves to be able to ward off the long-term impact of trauma. And so it's not just pushing against a dominant paradigm or what we're doing. It's really about our capacity to be resilient in being able to resist the kind of impact that trauma can have. So in this particular model that Norris provides us, you'll see that a crisis occurs, that we have a certain amount of functioning before the crisis, that resistance involves adapting to the incident in a way that brings to bear the resources that we have developed in our pre-event functioning. The crisis can also garner another kind of response, and that is this kind of loop of stressor, resource mobilization, a development of kind of a robustness and redundancy. And then we get into this area that's called transient dysfunction. That's one way of describing acute traumatic response. And that is that we all have experienced ways of coping that maybe we weren't in control of. How many of you have lost sleep in the last 6 months? How many of you have gained weight? How many of you have experienced episodes of depression? How many of you have experienced relational difficulties? from time to time that are exacerbated because we're in the midst of this. So transient dysfunction is really the period of time when we are trying to reestablish an equilibrium based on how we have been and now what we've experienced and where we're going. That transient dysfunction can either lead toward resilience, which is the ability to engage in adaptive behaviors such as the ones we've been talking about, or it can create experiences of more vulnerability, which then perpetuate more dysfunction. So I want you to think about this in terms of personal issues, like, if transient dysfunction has been, related to lack of exercise, as an example. We'll go with, resilience might be creating the mechanism to be able to engage your body and do more exercise and increase the capacity of your immune system and for you to feel healthier and to lose weight and those kinds of things. That experience of overeating or gaining weight during this time as a matter of vulnerability could be to just simply remain unconscious to the fact that this is doing, or ignoring it, continuing to perpetuate habits that can contribute to longer term immune suppressed response, or to chronic illness that then perpetuates even more dysfunction. And when you put this on the community-wide level, we go back to what we were talking about a moment ago. Communities can either engage in dialogue that open themselves up to different narratives and to take responsibility for what's transpired, or they can continue to snipe at each other about who's wrong and who's right and whose narrative needs to be supreme, and create increasing and longer lasting experiences of vulnerability that ultimately plague communities for decades and lifetimes. When we talk about components of community resilience, we're really talking about robustness, redundancy, rapidity, and resourcefulness. Let me see if I can pull up my my note about that. Where is my note? Just a minute. So robustness under these circumstances is the ability to withstand stress without suffering degradation, right? Resistance is a strategy. A resistance strategy is robust if it keeps out or counteracts a wide variety of dangers. It's fragile if it works only under a small number of possible things. Redundancy is the extent to which elements are substitutable in the event of disruption or degradation. So we need to have not just one type of resource, we need to have multiple resources available to us. And rapidity being the capacity to achieve goals in a timely manner to contain losses and avoid disruption. Resourcefulness being the ability to utilize what we have on hand in the event that we lack resources to be able to achieve whatever goals are in front of us. And I want us to look at these within the context of resilience as the adaptive capacity of communities at large, right? So this is a model that Norris puts forth. Community resilience as a set of networked adaptive capacities. It involves economic development, information and communication, community competence, and social capital, right? Economic development is fairness of risk, and vulnerability to hazards, levels of diversity, equity of resource distribution. It's the experience of having access to economic resources for developing an economic capacity to be able to sustain oneself during a time of economic insecurity, or to be able to build the resources necessary to respond to that reality. Information and communication has to do with narratives again. Whose narrative is dominant here? The availability of responsible media, right? And then the idea of there being, with responsible media, other trusted sources of information, and the skills and infrastructure that are necessary to be able to wed these two. Community competence has to do with the ability for the community to act in any given direction, the ability for the community to be able to engage in critical reflection and problem-solving skills, like we talked about a moment ago, the ability for the community to be flexible and creative, the collection and efficacy of a collective and effective empowerment, and political partnerships. This is all about the ability for communities essentially to feel like they are an important part of any response that is going on in the wider region where we've impacted. And then social capital, right? The ability to receive social support that is expected or enacted. The idea of social embeddedness, right? The notion that we have informal ties that we're able to rely on. Organizational and other kinds of linkages and cooperation, citizen participation and leadership, a sense of community, an attachment to place. All of these are dynamics of community resilience. And I think for each of us, it's a matter of thinking about the quality of our experience with these dynamics within the larger community and within the sub-communities that we belong to, as to how well they feel like we are, and the organizations we're involved with feel like they are integrated into the larger community response. What can communities do? Engage in social education and awareness, the training of community workers, public mental health, promotive activities, encouraging indigenous coping strategies, cultural rituals and ceremonies, community interventions with families, groups, expressive methods, rehabilitation, and prevention. In addition to this, I think it's important for us to think about the community as providing what the, of intervening where the formal structures haven't been able to provide the necessary resources to the level that they do. And I think about some of the efforts dealing with homelessness and hunger in our community related to COVID as one of the examples, transportation being another. We have a variety of examples of what we can do as grassroots efforts in relationship to what the government itself and the city and the Commonwealth and the federal government have been able to do as well. So that is the second half of the presentation on community resilience. And really the questions for us, and I'll take any questions, frankly, are in what ways have we experienced or witnessed resiliency of the community during this time of crisis, or the lack thereof of resiliency? What resources have you experienced that are available to enhance the community's resiliency, and what resources do you believe we need to develop in order to enhance community resiliency?
I'm hoping Chris O'Keefe will just jump right in, or anyone else who has a question or a comment.
There we go. So you can see me too. Thank you, Amy. So Aaron, this has been terrific. I really appreciate being able to hear it all. Just the idea of redundancy as a positive value is something that I think is worthy of some attention, because I'm, as most of you who know me know, I just retired after 7 years at the Greater Worcester Community Foundation. Prior to that, I worked for 20 years at United Way of Mass Bay. So I'm kind of steeped in philanthropy. And boy, am I sick of hearing people talk about how there are too many nonprofits, as if that were the problem to be solved. is that I think redundancy is a value and it should be built in. And when we think about systems, we think about, in the way Aaron was talking about, redundancy is an important thing to do. It's nuanced, you have to be careful, so you have to be coordinated and all of that. But redundancy is a feature, not a bug.
And I think that, Chris, the larger meditation on that is that one of the ways that we maintain a dominant narrative that subordinates or marginalizes aspects of the community is by concentrating on the capacity for the potential for abuse within the system, as opposed to the potential for use of the system. And so, I go through this all the time when we have people that are, using the food pantry as an example. And someone will come up to me and say, I saw them yesterday at another food pantry. And I'm like, ooh, you mean they got $140 worth of groceries this month instead of 70? When I'm spending $150 a week on groceries, and so from my standpoint as a former emergency medical technician, redundancy is the lesson that we learned early on, where when we were tying someone to a backboard, every member of the team went around the backboard and checked every other knot on the backboard. Not so that we could find fault, but that so we all had the confidence that what we were about to do together was going to work. And people who are accessing community resources benefit from having as much networking with those resources as is humanly possible. And if we can get out of the paradigm that what we're trying to do is to reduce abuse and instead begin the process of recognizing the ability of people to expand their networks, the better off we're going to be. The other thing I wanted to say, when the comment earlier was around the kind of complaining and the conflict that we get into in community. I am a family systems theory kind of nut when it comes to this. I think that criticism is a cry for intimacy 9/10 out of the time. So when someone comes to me with criticism, instead of taking on the criticism itself immediately, what I want to remember is this is actually someone's desire to engage me. And if I can step away from needing to defend myself or to create another narrative or whatever, and instead respond to them with, tell me more. What's happening to you? Where is this coming from? I'm actually accomplishing what that person set out to do, whether they knew it or not in the moment. And so one of the things we can do to enhance community resiliency is to stop being reactive, especially with people who are complaining and who are frustrated, and instead take a step closer to them, not feel like we have to defend ourselves, but be more intentional about engaging each other in a way that allows people to tell their story so that they feel like they're heard and they feel like they're connected.
Aaron, if nobody else jumps in, I was kind of hoping you might spend a little more time talking about, you had the two photos and the guy who, the hero that later died by suicide. I kind of got in a mental loop about what was going on for him and how could the community have contributed or helped or.
Well, part of what happened was because he maintained ownership to that particular image, he became the constant focus of the story and needed to, it was caught in a position where he had to tell a story over and over and over again. And the community forgot he was also significantly impacted by this. And so the context in which that tragedy occurred, now it wasn't a tragedy in the moment because they saved the little girl, right? And I think about the difference between that and the other photo where the firefighter is actually carrying a dead child, right? And the paramedic who's carrying the child who was saved was traumatized by having to tell and revisit that experience over and over and over again, and the community not recognizing that they also needed help and assistance and needed to distance themselves from this in a way that allowed them to gain an equilibrium. The other firefighter, disassociated himself with that image altogether, so that he wasn't the continual focus of that effort, didn't have to re-engage the story all the time, was able to access the kinds of resources that allowed him to integrate his experience into the larger context of things. One of the things that happens for firefighters and police officers and EMTs and ER personnel is when we're in the midst of a crisis response, in the middle of an emergency response, we don't see faces, right? We may remember bodies and injuries, but we don't. And when you have an experience where you can't rely on that as a mechanism to guard against being completely traumatized over and over again, by being asked to tell the story over and over again, then your capacity to function in that position ceases. So I want us to take care as a community and to remember that part of our resiliency is the health and well-being of all of our frontline people. And one of the questions is, what are we going to be asking them to do as this evolves, not just in terms of their response, but as we start to create a narrative, to be careful in how we invite and involve the people who are on the front lines, so that we don't just simply continue to traumatize folks along the way.
Amy, so what you just said, Rev, also reflects on also something else, which is personal conflict on these individuals. So I remember, because I think there was even a movie about that first incident a long time ago. And I think what was highlighted also was with these heroes, even with the soldiers that come back from war, we term them as heroes. There's always an amazing homecoming, and we call them heroes. But remember, there's also personal conflict. There's the PTSD. So when you're telling them they're heroes, they're busy asking themselves questions like, what's so heroic about killing someone? What's so heroic about having to torture someone? Like, do you understand? There is nothing heroic about that. So even with that scenario, I remember there was a narrative on personal conflict, where as a human being without that title, you probably are also struggling with your own demons. Like, I don't think I'm good enough. I don't think. Then someone is calling you a hero and you're thinking, oh, am I just heroic because I did that? So as you said, yeah, we need to be careful as we think that we are giving praise, we might be also causing some downfall in one way or another. And just a quick one, also, I agree with Chris, who spoke earlier about redundancy. I mean, come to think about it, what is wrong with having too many solutions?
Right.
What is, how is it, can you even say too many solutions? Is it even right to say that? Because I think that would be a summary of what at times NGOs are like non-governmentals are compelled to look like they have too much to offer. And there's nothing like that. I mean, I don't even know how to, frame that. So it's just a matter of probably using that to give platform and see the gaps, especially in formal systems. I think that's where the issue comes in, where now they're challenged, because if all these solutions are still being offered, then there must be loopholes, there must be gaps from the initial source of those solutions.
Right. And I think that there's a lot of work we could do as a community related to things like soldiers coming back. But, part of it is the issue sometimes of the moral ambiguity of what they experienced in a theater of war, what is versus what's required of them in their in a civilian context. The other piece of it is, just thinking about the healthcare workers that, we want to call heroic, but who have had family conflicts or who have experienced the trauma of being away from their families for months on end during this time period. People who had, very different kinds of experiences with the systems in which they worked that can either exacerbate these experiences or they can assist during them. There's so much more to what people carry in terms of their narratives than what we tend to recognize in the community when we want to name and claim their actions in a particular way. Other comments or responses?
This has been so helpful, Aaron. Do you have any thoughts about sort of just burnout? I'm sure many people here are in that space where, we need some rejuvenation, where we've been, the compassion fatigue, the sort of ongoing nature of this, still no clear end in sight. Many of the problems have persisted since the beginning, remain unsolved. And it just can feel so overwhelming. And I know that's your space.
So let's be clear that we all have instinctual preconditioned responses to traumatic events. We talk about them in terms of fight, flight, and flee. I talk about them in terms of fight, flight, flee, or fight, flight, fight, flight, being rigid. I mean, just sort of standing still, right? And fix is the other one.
Freeze, right?
Freeze, fight, flight, freeze, and I add fix to it as well, because that tends to be a tendency, especially from those of us who have been enculturated into Western masculinity, right? That fix can be a thing that we try to engage in. And so part of the issue around burnout and things like that is we all have these dominant tendencies, and most of the time they're not choices. Most of the time they're reactions, which is why when you want to call someone a hero and there's this ambiguity in their head about it, it's because this wasn't a choice they made. They just did what they were conditioned to do as a response. The issue of burnout over time is really the issue of putting energy flow in only one direction, right? Energy that is going from us into something, but very little energy coming back at us for which we can be filled. And so it has to do with the chronic nature of our response, potentially. We talked about the physiology of trauma and how if we don't take care of ourselves as bodies, if we don't do the kinds of things that lend themselves to us feeling like we have the energy to respond, then what we do is put ourselves in a state of unresponsiveness, of the inability to respond effectively. And burnout is really kind of the ultimate stage of that inability to respond because we have depleted ourselves so badly. I'm aware here, for example, this is rarely talked about with Martin Luther King Jr., but in the same time period that Martin Luther King Jr. was building the civil rights movement and working as he was through the southern states, there were also a number of experiments in utopian community that were occurring along the way, and activists within the civil rights movement that were taking advantage of the ability to go on retreat and to think with a group of people about what they were doing and how they were doing it, and to really be able to feed themselves. It's interesting to me to note that Martin Luther King Jr. never took a retreat and never took a vacation. And that part of what the lesson I think that we need to hear is that self-care is not the antithesis to our responsibility to serve in the way we're called to serve. Self-care is in service to our ability to carry out what we believe we are called to do. And it is only when we are willing to say, I have to take this time and do these things because if I don't, I can't do the other. And really what we get into when we talk about burnout are scenarios where people have not been able to find ways of being able to fill themselves with enough energy and a sense of purpose to do this work over a longer period of time.
Beautiful. Anyone else comments, questions, thoughts about what you heard here today? Hopefully you found it as helpful as I have. The chat has had lots of good ideas and suggestions too. Somebody just mentioned The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. Howard Zare, Changing Lenses, Restorative Justice. That sounds good.
Yeah, and I love Nemo's response. People are just tired. There's a difference between fatigue and burnout, right? Fatigue is a normal response to being without energy. Burnout is the sustained experience of not having energy. And so we all can get fatigued. Burnout is something far more serious than fatigue itself, because it is really the inability to experience refilling, right? And I love the Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris is also a wonderful thing that Cardines was talking about. I want to just finish our time together, because I know we're about to get on with one more. I want to return, if we would, for a moment to the issue of the butterfly. And what I want to do is go to a different experience of the butterfly. And these are the words of the poet Sue Smolin. She writes, Buddha was walking in wild rain, noting the brilliance of wedded things, when in the puddle he saw a monarch butterfly outstretched and drenched. Buddha paused to consider a beautiful death, but the butterfly was still alive and with no hope for swimming much longer, and took the Buddha's finger in refuge. Buddha lifted the monarch, tucked it into the nook of his topknot, and replaced his rain hat. In the pelting wet, Buddha danced as if he were a storm-proof butterfly, which he was. Buddha hummed wing-warming words, and every being, winged or not winged, became aware of something. I hope that you all are able to find ways of accessing your storm-proof butterfly nest. And if you want to talk more about what we discussed today, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'll put my name in the chat, and certainly Amy will have that along with the slides to be able to share when the video of this particular gathering is made available.
Thank you so much, Aaron. You did not disappoint with you totally brought it. We're really grateful for all that you've done to kind of keep us sustained through hard times. Thank you. We will we'll share the recording out on our Facebook page. Worcester Address Childhood Trauma. Thank you. Our next 2 sessions are going to be by the Child Trauma Training Center. So they promise to be really excellent. So we're just kind of getting the content pinned down. So look forward to those, please. Again, we're so grateful for all of you that have tuned in today. I hope it was helpful. It's really helpful to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Amy, thank you for all your work.
Aaron, this was amazing. So much to think about now, and just a lot of really helpful frames. And it is interesting to see sort of when you're trained on the personal level versus where you're trained, your training is up higher, at higher level. It's similar, like the same sort of processes and ideas and important points, but different lenses can really help you see it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so grateful to everyone chiming in today. Every one of the folks here brings such a remarkable and responsive kind of insight into this. I'm deeply grateful to all of you. So,
Thank you.
see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.